sort of different version of celebrating this day. So my role at the Wildlife Conservation Society is the Director of Education. And what that basically means is that I'm in charge of the learning and engagement that happens in our 5 parks here in New York. So that the 5 parks, if you don't know, are the Bronx Zoo, the New York Aquarium, Central Park Zoo, the Queen Zoo, and the Prospect Park Zoo. And so we have teams of educators in all of those parks who really work to increase the science learning and engagement with nature, and the focus on advocacy towards conservation issues, particularly facing wildlife and wild places. And what I basically do is, besides just go to meetings and talk with people, is really look at trends, look at things that are important for various communities. I have a lot of conversations with community members to try to understand what their needs are and what we as a cultural institution, as well as a science-based NGO that's in 60 different countries throughout the world, what we can do to help meet those needs, but then also how the organization can benefit from the unique perspectives and backgrounds of our community members. And so, as Lindsay mentioned, I really look to create equitable pathways to science and conservation engagement. And a lot of that comes from democratizing cultural institutions. So it's really about who is at the table, who's at the leadership table, who isn't at that leadership table, and what are the steps that we as leaders within the organization need to take in order to ensure that there is an inclusive representation of voices. So for example, one of the things that we did recently, like a few years ago, is we started a youth employee advisory council. We were talking to young people who are part-time people, many, it's their first job. We actually have a lot of part-time staff members, even from Fordham. And one of the things is that when we were having these large-scale discussions as an organization, the voice of part-time staff members wasn't there. And as an educator, one of the things that's really important for me is that we have pathways for everyone to pursue science. And because so many science-based careers are predominantly dominated by certain backgrounds, there are certain communities, particularly Black, Latino, and women, who are not represented in the field in an equal way. And so this also comes from just science and engagement and community members. So we took all of that together and created the Youth Employee Advisory Council. I can certainly send a link out afterwards. We have a toolkit that we created to also then take what we learned from that advisory council, how they've helped guide and transform our organization into something that is much broader and could be adapted to other cultural institutions. Now, a lot of people, when they hear that kind of work, they think, but I thought you ran education in a zoo. Isn't that field trips and summer camp? And yes, it absolutely is field trips and summer camps and overnights and parties and school field trips. We have an amazing team who does that, but it's guided on those principles of ensuring that there is, that we give a lot of thought, that we think about, we think about critical consciousness. We think about ways in which we can ensure that people who are coming to our parks are having an experience that is relevant to them and is also firmly rooted in science and in the best ways in which to engage multiple audiences. The ways in which that where I kind of came to this path, so I know that's part of this career development piece. What I did was, I grew up in a small town in Western Pennsylvania. So not the Pennsylvania that's close, the Pennsylvania that's basically Ohio, but mostly Kentucky, if you know what I mean. And when we were way, way over there, very small town, one of the things that, I wanted to do is when I went off to college, I definitely wanted to leave and go to a big city, which was Pittsburgh at the time. And so I went to the University of Pittsburgh, and I didn't really declare a major. I was just kind of thinking through things. And I looked through my work study jobs, which could be available. And there was one that was to work in the education department at the Natural History Museum. And I was just like, well, that sounds like a really cool job. A lot of these other things were like office jobs. And, so I was just like, oh, let's see what this is. And I went in, and it really just, it just changed my perspective. And I think a lot of that experience of starting off as a part-time person in the museum has certainly shaped my pathway, and certainly shaped the way, you know, I think about other people's pathways. So when they are coming in for that first job, how that experience can be more than just helping out with classes and tours, but also can work to cultivate that person and see that person move forward in their own career trajectory. So I was in the education department at the Natural History Museum for many years as a work study student. And then when I went on to grad school, I was, you know, hired as a part-time person overseeing educational programs, camps, and overnights. And then I decided to pursue my teaching degree. And while I was finishing up that, I was a substitute teacher as well. And I realized very quickly that I did not want to go into formal education. And so I went into my boss and I just pulled together a plan on all the different things that I was doing in the museum. And there was like a couple openings. I said, if we combined all these together, could this be a full-time job? And she gave it some thought, and then it happened. And I was able to, you know, work in you know, as a full-time education department member and lead those programs. And then eventually came to New York and was hired as the curator of education at the Prospect Park Zoo. And basically that job was to oversee the educational opportunities at the zoo. And it was really a great place to test out new ideas, to think about ways in which people are engaging, thinking about the use of theater, arts, technology, exhibit development, all of those different ways in which we can connect with people, and also just learn from the communities as well. So that trajectory took me through many years. I never expected when I started off at the Prospect Park Zoo that I would be, you know, in this field in this organization for as long as I have been. But I'll say that, you know, working in an informal science education department, there are lots of places in which mobility can happen. I think the key is really about seeing innovate, you know, having those innovative ideas and not being afraid to pursue it. It's about, you know, reaching out and trying to find a mentor, someone who can help you. And that mentor doesn't necessarily have to be from an official mentor program. It could just be someone that you meet with regularly. It can be, you know, for me, it happened to have been my previous boss at the Natural History Museum. I would reach out to her and ask for certain, you know, ideas or suggestions. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an informal place, but I think having someone to kind of go to was really helpful. The other thing that I think really helped my growth was in New York, we have something called the New York City Museum Education Roundtable, NYCMR, horrible acronym, but NYCMR really enabled me to network across many different cultural institutions and museums to really understand what people were doing. You know, there are some museums that are light years ahead of zoos and aquariums, and so I was able to pull some of those ideas and see how we could modify them, you know, to work in our parks. In other cases, we could be a leader and talk through some of the different things that we were doing and use that to further move along our ideas. And I think the other piece that was really important is that power of saying yes. You know, I think about when I was at the Central Park Zoo, I moved from Prospect to the Central Park Zoo as a curator. The director there was actually part of the Fordham Bio PhD program. And he was working with another student on a project, and he said, you know, I think that what we could do here is really interesting. Is there a way to do urban ecology somewhere in the zoo? And I said, well, you know, I think we could. We haven't really done too much of that. But, you know, we were able to pull together an internship in which the organization and Fordham worked together on, you know, supporting this student. Many of you, you know, may have heard of Jason Alosio, who is one of the Fordham Bio graduates, and also now runs a program called Project True. And that program came out of that power of saying yes, right? It was, sure, we'll have an intern. And when he came, we tested out a couple different ideas. It took a while before it developed into what we have now with Project True. But that's, you know, that program where students from local communities, particularly in the Bronx, come and they conduct urban ecology research with Fordham undergraduates and also leaders in the bio department. at Fordham, as well as scientists at WCS and the Bronx Zoo in particular. That program has led to, over 250 students going to college. We have 100% college attendance rate, and 89% are STEM majors. And these are all people who are underrepresented in the science fields. And this came from an idea of, this came from that power of saying yes. And that also that power of listening and having conversations with people and figuring out what works and what doesn't and tweak along the way. And so those are some of the things that I think have really helped in my career pathway, and one in which I think can, cross over in many different ways in which, whatever kind of job you're pursuing. I know that listening to someone talk for a very long time can really be exhausting. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take some questions. I could certainly keep talking about myself for another 20 minutes, but I'm also happy to answer any questions that people have. And I think if you want, you can just put them in the chat box. Okay, I paused long enough, I guess, for that. So I think one of the things that we've been talking about in terms of career pathways is also what careers are available in the zoo. A lot of people ask, like, okay, great, so it's there. What are the options for, someone like me? I don't know the backgrounds of the group that's on this call right now, but we're basically like a town. We have every possible job you could imagine. So we have graphic designers who develop our digital content as well as our exhibit content. We have obviously, people who are in biology and in animal behavior and science. We have veterinary care, of course. We also have some jobs that people don't think about, right? So we have a whole, we have web team, we have, people in finance, we have grant writers, budget directors, we have plumbers, painters, we have facilities, engineers. I mean, we have water quality specialists. We have people whose only job is to make sure that the water is clear and perfect for a variety of different animals, depending on their particular needs. We have nutritionists. We have a number of different things in which we, we're able to do, make sure that our animals get, as we say, it's really expensive to feed otters when they eat sushi grade sea urchins. Oh, I see a question here. Did you go to pursue a PhD? Do you feel like an advanced degree changes the opportunities available for the informal education world? I'm ABD. I can say that now. It's been a very hard path. Yeah, so I did pursue my PhD at Antioch. I got through all of the different things, but I also realized that I had a number of job changes along the way in working full time and having 2 children during a time when you're also pursuing your PhD made it really difficult, and eventually had to let it go. So that was certainly challenging personally. Professionally, I do think that it really depends on the direction that you want to go, right? I think that having a PhD and pursue in an informal education world, I think if you're going into, we have a whole team that focuses on research and evaluation to ensure the effectiveness of our programming and the work that we do. And I think having that research background helps not only in creating quality work, but I think it also helps in raising the legitimacy of social science research in a very sort of like, I don't like to call it hard science, but when you have, people in animal health and veterinary health and in biology and field research, that can certainly help. But to pursue a PhD, if you want to lead an education department, like a curator of education at an organization, I don't think it's absolutely necessary, but I think it's also just based on your personal interests. I think it's also just based also on, finances and ensuring that if you are pursuing that PhD, that there is that support there available. I don't think it can hurt you, but I think you just have to, kind of look at your life plan and see where that all fits in for sure. Any other questions? One of the things that when people think about STEM careers, they don't, or science, careers, they don't necessarily think of informal, education as, or museum education as a STEM career. But they think that there's a lot of learning that has to take place in terms of ensuring how you can effectively teach, especially teaching in a setting where you may be interacting with someone for 30 seconds. And it's not very, it's not that huge in-depth piece. So when we think about audiences and we think about the learning, we think about not just the people who are coming into our parks, but we also think about the people who are teaching the people. And so I think that's why we probably spend as much time as we do on cultivating the learning of our staff members. When people come in, whether it's something for Project True, like the Project True mentors get 3 full weeks of training before they lead a 7-week program. And so some people might say, wow, that seems like not really a great ROI if you're, spending all this time training someone and then they're doing a program and then that's it. But the reality is that we're training, the undergraduate students, the Fordham students, on life skills that they'll take with them for forever in some kind of capacity. And, that audience is just as important to us as the people who are coming into our doors or are coming in for field trips. And I think the goal of those programs is really about ensuring that, people feel empowered to pursue whatever interest they have, whether they are, whether it's a science career, whether it's focusing in a number of different directions, but then also, intertwined in all of that is our mission in terms of conservation. And it's very relevant here for Earth Day to think about conservation in terms of, the work that we can do to inspire visitors to change their behavior, but also just to connect with nature. For many of our audiences, they live in urban areas where they can't access green spaces in a safe way. And the zoos can be a part of that opportunity for them. And so we really think about ourselves, not just in terms of all of the science content, but also that place to connect with nature. I see a question here. What have you found to be the most rewarding aspect of your career thus far? I think that there are a number of ways in which you can gauge fulfillment or, rewarding. But what I will say is there are these moments when we host these large events, right? So it might be something we call JIVE, which is Job Internship Volunteer Expo. It might be the District 12 Science Fair. We have schools throughout the District 12 in the Bronx come to the zoo for a big district-wide science fair competition. There are many different, moments. We also have things where we have Autism Awareness Day, and we have families. We open the zoo early, and families with autism can come in early. Those moments, there's that time when people have checked in and things are crazy, but there's all of this, that there's just this pause and this feeling of like, oh, this is what it's all about, right? We have hundreds of people here running around, doing all the things that we planned, and we're troubleshooting, but people are acting as a team. And that synergy that happens between the leadership, the people doing the work, and the guests all come together around that central mission. And that's just really a rewarding aspect of the work that continues. It started when I first started doing, this career, and has continued throughout that whole process. So that certainly drives me. Okay, next question is, in your time working in zoos and education, do you see people combining informal education, conservation, research work, and hands-on work with animals as a job or career? I'm currently pursuing a PhD at Fordham Bio and have a background in animal care, education, and research. I really love to combine all of these elements. Yep, absolutely. I would say that pretty much most of the curatorial staff at the zoo do that, right? So they have backgrounds where maybe they started in informal education or education, have been doing, research, and then also work with animals. So that job is, that particular background is where a lot of people in our animal department fit. Some of them started off, in education. Some started off doing research and then wanted to go into education. and then we're pursuing that PhD in research. I think the hardest place, the place to balance that is really around what your expectations would be of research, because ultimately you're in a zoo, and thinking about someone who is the curator of mammals, for example, you could be in the zoo and you're focusing on your research, but then what happens is an animal is ill, or there's a new exhibit opening, or there's a number of different things that come into play, and so sometimes that research can move down the sort of like level of of importance of that list to do, that sort of it's less mission critical, and it becomes sort of a nice thing to do, but then other times it can elevate up, exactly, in the sort of opposite way. So I think combining all of those pieces it makes a lot of sense. And we always say that the people who can work with education and who are happy also talking to people are not only the most successful in the zoo and aquarium world, but also just are happy, because if you're annoyed if the educators or the program people are reaching out to you saying, hey, would you like to talk to this group of teens or whatever, and you're like, oh, I hate doing that, you'll just be frustrated because we don't stop asking people for things. But the people who are really just eager to help and when they can. Now, sometimes it's a time issue, but I think if you enjoy talking to people, people they just want to talk to the experts in some kind of way. Even if it's just a 5-minute keeper interaction, it can really make a big difference. Sure. One of the other things that I think people have, when they're thinking about careers and career pathways, one of the questions that we sometimes get is if you sort of like, what are those big challenging moments? What are those things that you wish you had known, or ways you would have prepared to help you better? And I would say that if you are pursuing, a career in informal, in an informal sciences organization or in many organizations, there are two things that I would recommend everyone know how to do or practice. The first is, if you can write, or if you can practice to figure out how to write better, I really recommend doing that. It is surprising how hard it is to find people who can write. And, we don't need novels, but I need someone to be able to write a grant report. I need someone who, when I say, hey, you're doing a really great job on that program, can you send me a paragraph so I can elevate this to the director? I would love to be able to have someone who can do that. Sometimes we're asked to write, an article, or, just for a submission. Doesn't have to be like a research article, even just something for an upcoming, zoo and aquarium, conference meeting or whatever. It's really, writing is, I think, a really key aspect that a lot of people forget. If you're pursuing one thing, you're like, oh yeah, but I can write, but then, your topic sentence doesn't match things, the grammar is incorrect. I mean, those are the things that just really are exhausting, especially if you're developing things like even just web content, right? You can't have misspellings and, a change in voice when you're, writing content on a website. And then the other thing is just a real understanding of how to run a business, even if it's a small thing like how to make a budget or read a budget sheet. I think a lot of people don't think about that financial literacy as such an important component. And I will say a big part of my job really is about ensuring that the budgets are accurate, especially if you're in a nonprofit. If your supervisor says to you, great, you can run this program you have to bring in $50,000, and and your budget to spend is, $46,000, right? If you go $10,000 over on your expenses by not keeping track of the number of hours someone is working or some of those things, that can make or break whether that program will ever be able to continue, right? So I think just understanding what, what sort of that financial literacy aspect is just an important component of this kind of job.